Roberts and Roberts Brokerage and Libertopia are pleased to present Everyone Hates Activists and How Bitcoin is Changing That by M.K. Lords, editor of Bitcoin Not Bombs and panelist on the Bitcoin Group. My name is M.K. Lords. I'm the editor at Bitcoin Not Bombs, the office manager at Roberts and Roberts Brokerage, and then I also host a weekly show on the World Crypto Network called Crypto Combos, and I'm a panelist on the Bitcoin Group. So I want to go into a little bit about my background as an activist. The title of my talk is Everyone Hates Activists and How Bitcoin is Changing That. So I got into activism probably about 10 years ago. What inspired me to get into activism was the George W. Bush administration, and I initially got into anti-war activism on the left. I believe that George W. Bush was a fascist, and I still do. And so naturally, I ended up getting involved in the anti-war left and registered as a Democrat, playing lots of angry music and, kind of raging against a lot of Republican stuff. So I grew up in a very right-wing military town, so that kind of pushed me in the opposite direction. So I kind of backlashed into the far left. And I started becoming concerned in the political sense when I started looking at the different Democratic candidates who I was deciding on voting for during the 2008 election. But the more I kind of started listening to what these candidates were saying, the more I was kind of disappointed in what they were saying. And they didn't really sound like they were saying anything significant. So I started questioning things. I had a lot of liberal friends at the time who were really obsessed with Obama, and they thought that he had a lot of promise, but I couldn't really connect with what he was saying. It just sounded like a lot of eloquently said empty rhetoric. So I started looking into third-party candidates or other alternatives, and a couple of good friends started telling me about this guy named Ron Paul. And at first I was like, oh, he's a Republican, do we need another white guy in the White House? But I started looking into him, and he really resonated with a lot of the things I already believed as a leftist, especially on cultural issues. So I got involved on the political level in the 2008 Ron Paul campaign. And I started campaigning and phone banking, canvassing, all the stuff associated with political activism. But what ended up happening was I got really disillusioned with the kind of rhetoric and some of the actions surrounding political activism. So some of the problems that I saw were things like voting machines that weren't very well secured, people shutting out third-party candidates out of the debates, and all of the dirty tactics involved in politics. So at the end of it, I was very disheartened, of course. I even changed my affiliation to Republican to vote for Ron Paul, and I cringed as I did it because I had turned into, over this time, I turned into a left libertarian. So it was a very, kind of cringe-inducing moment for me to finally change it over to Republican to vote for this guy. But I did, and as I got more politically involved, I just got more disillusioned with it. To me, the whole process seemed like a dirty joke that wasn't very funny. So I pulled away from politics. I got completely turned off, but I still wanted to do activism. So after the election, what I tried to focus on was finishing my English degree at the time, and I ended up running into some financial problems and found myself unable to afford college. And I also started studying more about student loan debt and some of the problems associated with that and questioning the general direction of my degree. So I ended up dropping out of college. But that didn't mean I stopped studying. What it did is it allowed me to study more topics independently, which I was really grateful for, and I actually look back on it as one of the best decisions I've made because it allowed me to broaden my focus to a lot of other subjects other than just English. So this was good, and what I started doing at the time, I was working as a server at a restaurant, and to supplement my income, I started making hula hoops and hula hoop dancing, which sounds really weird, but I have a background in dance, and I saw a girl dancing at a festival, ended up becoming friends with her and learning how to make my own hoops and giving lessons and performing and things like that to supplement my income on the side. My only caveat was that I would pay taxes for my labor, but not for my art. I didn't realize at the time that there was a word for this, and the word for that was called agorism. So I was a part-time agorist at the time, and eventually, through a friend, as I was kind of changing, my focus on career, I was stuck as a server, and it was kind of a little bit of a depressing time. But I ended up getting a job at the as an office manager at Roberts and Roberts Brokerage, and from there I was able to learn more about precious metals, how markets worked. I got a better understanding of economics in general. And so that was really great, and it also propelled me into more agorist-related activism.
So what I focused on from there was trying to encourage people to use alternative currencies like silver. And other things. I started educating people about their rights regarding the police. And civil disobedience has always been something that has really motivated me and that I've really admired and tried to incorporate into the activism I do. And so I jumped around all over the place with a lot of different labels for myself. I briefly dabbled in anarcho-capitalism. I used the term agorist to describe my beliefs for a while, and now I don't really have, I guess, a label. I guess I'm some kind of weird anarchist, I guess you could say. So I'm some kind of anarchist. It's okay. And as I started just studying different things, I kept hearing this word pop up around my libertarian friends, Bitcoin. What is this Bitcoin stuff? So as a precious metals person, I was very, very skeptical of Bitcoin. I was like, is this something that is really going to catch on? Is this just a Ponzi scheme? What is going on with this Bitcoin thing? And the people I knew who knew the most about it were completely obsessed with it. So I was like, well, these are smart people. What is this thing that makes them so obsessed about it? So I started studying more, and I really feel like that changed the direction of my activism in a very positive way. As soon as I better understood the implications of Bitcoin, everything changed for me. So from there, I got involved in Bitcoin Not Bombs, and eventually became the editor, where I run the blog there. I write informative articles and also edit other articles for technical or social issues, kind of a wide variety. And I also got into organizing conferences, which I've done 2 this year, and those were definitely great learning experiences for me. And also meetups in Pensacola, which are just great educational tools. I really wanted to focus on getting people educated because it's such a weighty topic to try to study. But if you've been involved in activism a while, you've probably realized that it's often an uphill battle in terms of results. And you probably get a lot of, bad feedback. There's all these different, sometimes opposing routes you can take with your activism. There's political activism, there's counter-economic activism, and then there's a lot of stuff in between. But regardless of the type of activism you do, you probably aren't well liked by activism, or by non-activists. So what I mean by that is there's studies that show that most people dislike activists, or as Slate so eloquently put it, everyone hates activists. So the study showed that your average person regards activists as, quote, militant, eccentric, unhygienic people. So, which can come as a surprise, from people in the liberty movement. And even if those adjectives tend to imply kind of a leftist form of activism, feminist or environmentalism. And so a lot of liberty people don't think of themselves as activists in the traditional sense, but they are. Even if you wear a bow tie and a suit, you're still considered an activist, and people probably still find you annoying. And I know this because I've been on the receiving end as being a very hardcore, gung-ho person, either as an anarcho-capitalist or, in other forms of, even when I was doing leftist activism, you get a lot of negative feedback from people, or people just kind of brush you out, you take things too seriously. So what I did notice too was, despite this kind of difference in appearance of, between libertarians and kind of left activists, there's a lot of bickering in libertarian circles over who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. And whether you're involved in the political side or the hairy or agorism side or a middling mesh of the two, according to the echo chamber, you're wrong and should feel bad. And you're probably hurting the movement, whatever that means. So you kind of see political people attacking the idealism of agorists, and agorists thinking that political people have kind of sold out, and all this stuff. Maybe they're both right, but let's face it, Joe Beergut hates you both. But this general aversion to activists bodes poorly for progress. People want to see quick, progressive change happen, but they don't like the people doing it. They regard them as too radical and that they're pushing for things too fast. So there's always this question of how do we get people involved and motivated for positive changes that are turned off by these radicals. And here's where I think Bitcoin comes in as a way to kind of bridge that gap between your average person who's not that much concerned with activism and your hardcore, like, anti-state anarchist activist. What I'll be doing today is dividing activism into 2 groups, intentional activists and unintentional activists. And I'm going to argue how when we turn ordinary consumers into activists, they're actually useful for changing this war-driven, debt-funded paradigm, even if they're unaware of it. And they end up helping out each other too. So first I'm going to cover some of the intentional activism that we see in the Bitcoin space. And there's a lot of overlap in the Bitcoin space and the libertarian space. There's a lot of overlap of activism. And it's really inspiring to see because all of this intentional activism, it's not only inspiring, but Bitcoiners are particularly supportive of it, especially when it comes to charity and, businesses who are really trying to, take on these radical projects. And something I would like to see a little bit more of in the liberty movement space, we've seen this a lot in Bitcoin, but maybe not so much in the liberty space, is, there's all this talk about charity and mutual aid, and these projects need funding to survive, but, you don't always see that kind of funding. And I know it's kind of difficult to raise funding for these things, and it's something that I would like to see a little more focus on because there's a lot of people doing the direct action work of it. It's just, difficult to get the funding. But something I will say is good in the liberty movement is you also see a lot of media sources that are better at securing funding. And these alternative media narratives, they're made a little bit better by Bitcoin too. Bitcoin opens up this whole new world of being able to fund projects in different ways. Now, Bitcoin has been shown to be a great source of funding for these necessary aid and media organizations. And the funding is operating on a vehicle that can't be stopped by central banks or governments. And this is really important if you want to support controversial organizations that are extremely active in challenging certain paradigms. So, say you want to support some controversial organizations like WikiLeaks or antiwar.com. You can use Bitcoin to directly fund citizen journalism and whistleblowing. So one of the first nonprofits to take Bitcoin was antiwar.com, and they did it partly in response to knowledge that the FBI was spying on them and trying to collect donor information. And this is a really terrifying thing. I think a lot of activists assume that they're probably on some kind of government watch list, or that they're being, I think there's a lot of paranoia among activists, right?
No,
not us. But there is a lot of paranoia. But it's a totally different thing when you find out that, no, you actually are being spied on by one of the most massive crime organizations in history, the US government. Yeah. So, by attacking antiwar.com's source of funding, the state tried to strike a fatal blow to an organization whose motives are entirely peaceful. And so you kind of discover that the cause of reducing war is a totally peaceful one, right? Like, why should that be controversial? Like, people wanting peace? But it's actually very dangerous. It's not only, it's culturally dangerous, it's politically dangerous. And I'm a believer that if war is the health of the state, peace is its destruction. And antiwar.com was able to get donations from another sector of very passionate activists, independent from their targeted donor base. And Bitcoin is a way that we can kind of keep these invaluable nonprofits going once the state attacks their source of funding. Now, in the case of WikiLeaks, there was a government crackdown on them too, but also PayPal was able to shut them down completely because they were having to go through this centralized money processor. Now, this is just as challenging. I think the threat from corporations is just as real as the threat from governments. If you are using a corporation for your money services, then they have the power to shut you down at any point for any arbitrary reason, or, no reason at all sometimes. So they began to take Bitcoin to stay afloat. And since then, they've provided vital information on the surveillance state. So this allowed them to continue functioning and continue reporting when they were highly threatened. I mean, they were specifically targeted. And you see that a lot with different organizations. And another one I want to briefly mention too is the Women's Annex. Now, I first found out about Women's Annex at Bitcoin in the Beltway back in June. And it's a very fascinating project. I didn't know that there were activists doing this. And this is really, really great. Because what the Women's Annex does is they teach women technical skills and pay them in Bitcoin for their content. And they have offices in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, and Mexico. And what they're doing is giving women a degree of independence in countries where many women can't have bank accounts or even money of their own. Their fathers or their husbands control their funds. So the Women's Annex encourages digital literacy by broadening internet access for millions of women, and they do this at a great personal risk too. I got to speak with Faresh Farrow, of the Women's Annex, and she described to me how they have to be very careful in certain countries when they're talking about what they do as the Women's Annex. So she travels all around the world to talk about what they're doing, but she can't really publicize it a lot in Afghanistan, where they're very highly active. It's actually, I mean, their lives are literally at risk with what they're doing, which is, educating women and giving them financial freedom with Bitcoin. And these organizations, they are really, they're risking their lives, they're putting their neck out on the line, and Bitcoin has provided them a buffer of protection that you don't get with the current legacy banking system. So I think I would say they're one of the best organizations to support if you really want to see real subversive activism in action. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the other charities and nonprofits in this space. So again, Bitcoiners are really, really supportive of charity. I kind of work in the charity nonprofit side of Bitcoin, and we've seen just a tremendous amount of support and also very effective activism coming out of this, as a result of funding from Bitcoin. For example, Free Aid fed and clothed thousands of people in the Philippines after the typhoon. This allowed them to get funding directly, and they were able to access remote locations that other aid organizations weren't able to. And there were even some problems with PayPal too, like in times of national disaster, or in times of typhoons, things like that. It can be very difficult to know if like certain charities are legitimate or funding is going to come through and things like that. So things can get kind of hairy during these disasters, and PayPal can again arbitrarily shut down this funding. So another one, Bitcoin Not Bombs. We do an annual Hoodie the Homeless event. We'll be doing another one this year, and it clothes and feeds and gives necessities to less fortunate people during the winter time. It gets really, really cold, and a lot of people, a lot of homeless people, they lack jackets and basic, things to survive in the wintertime. You see a huge spike in deaths from freezing to death. So another one is BitGive. They raised 32 Bitcoin for the water project to build a well in Kenya. And this is really interesting. And they also assist with a lot of other projects too. I would definitely encourage you to look into BitGive. And then Bitcoin 100 assists Bitcoin curious nonprofits with Bitcoin education and helps with funding them. And they also have a site, if you're looking to find a broader list of charities and nonprofits that take Bitcoin, visit Bitcoin 100. They have a list of about 90 charities that accept Bitcoin. So, but probably one of the most successful charities that you may have heard about in the Bitcoin space is Sean's Outpost Homeless Outreach. And my friend Mike Kimbrell is very active in this. He is out delivering food to people every single day in Pensacola, Florida. And so far, he's delivered over 125,000 meals to the homeless with a small team that he's organized. And they continue to kind of innovate and expand, and it's very much a feel-good story. Mike came out of Food Not Bombs, and if you're familiar with the work that they do, they feed the homeless without asking for permission. And what we've seen is even feeding the homeless is becoming a revolutionary act. Right. Yes, if you're familiar with the cases in Fort Lauderdale, there are a lot of Food Not Bomb activists who have been targeted and arrested. You may have heard the story of the 90-year-old man who was targeted recently in Fort Lauderdale for feeding the homeless because, what's that?
He was arrested 2 days in a row.
He was arrested 2 days in a row, exactly. And that feeding the homeless should be something that you ask permission from the government to do is just atrocious to me. I mean, why should anyone ask to be able to feed people? So it would be good to see more kind of decentralized solutions to this problem, and I think Bitcoin is kind of encouraging that. And, all of these organizations, like from anti-war activism to homelessness activism, are things, again, on the face should seem like benign, like common sense, like why can't we just do this without government permission? But because things are kind of been flipped upside down, you've seen it become, these extremely controversial issues. And when you're donating in Bitcoin, I do want to mention a little brief section on anonymity. So a lot of people, by taking the proper precautions, you can to a degree hide your identity if you're afraid of any kind of backlash from donating to these organizations. I do want to mention though, Bitcoin is not completely anonymous. Maybe some people have heard that. There's still some misconceptions, I think, among the libertarian community that Bitcoin is completely anonymous. It's completely not, actually. And I really can't stress this enough. If you want to add layers of privacy to your Bitcoin transactions, it really needs to be diligently researched. It's not something that's necessarily super easy to do for someone who's not very technical, and I know that because I don't come from a very technical background. So as I'm learning more about Bitcoin, it's blowing my mind in a lot of ways, but also making me have better security practices in general. And a couple good resources I do want to mention, if you're interested in this, is Anonymous Bitcoin book by Christoph Atlas. And then there's innovations like Dark Wallet that are creating ways to make this whole process more consumer friendly. And we're going to be seeing a version of it is already out, and they're working on improving that. And I think this is really interesting. What it'll basically allow you to do is be completely private in your transactions. And they're making it a lot more user-friendly, and by simply contributing financially to these sources doing kind of the difficult direct action work, you're engaging in effective activism, because these are people who not only say they're going to do something, but then actually do it and show results. So your Bitcoin goes a long way when you support these projects. But you do face all kinds of, kind of backlash, basically. What we're seeing now, too, I do want to briefly touch on regulations. It's something that people are probably very concerned about in the Bitcoin space. And this is something that, if you're involved in political activism, it might be more of an interest to you. I know there are a lot of political libertarians, and as you kind of see, what Bitcoin allows for is a variety and a diversity of tactics, basically. So if you want to kind of get into the fight in a political sense, I would definitely encourage you to do that, because what we're up against is these extreme regulations. You've probably heard of some of the regulations coming out of New York. And this is something that kind of tempers my idealism about the general direction of Bitcoin, because I don't want to be overly idealistic and say that something like, Bitcoin will be instrumental in overthrowing the nation state, because there are some really big hurdles, and I'd be remiss not to mention them. So really one of the worst is this hostile regulatory climate coming from people who don't understand Bitcoin. These are people who think that they can kind of build laws around things that they don't understand and kind of crack down. And what they're really focusing on is the centralized points of failure, the exchanges. So basically where you're able to convert fiat into Bitcoin and vice versa. And I think that's a serious threat. It's making it harder for people to start businesses, but also to continue functioning as an exchange. Some of the regulations they're proposing are, even worse than the already very bad anti-money laundering legislation. So I don't think they'll be necessarily effective. Ben Losky has literally said, this is the face, talking about himself, of financial security. And this is a person who presided over the mortgage crisis and some of these other crises. This is someone who already has shown that he can't protect you from any kind of, theft. I guess you're protected from maybe theft from, small vendors or something like that in some sense, but you're not protected from HSBC or Bank of America or any of these other giant corporate banks. And he's already on that side. I don't think these regulations, they're not to protect consumers, they're to protect the banks and the banking interests. And I think that's the only, and they think they can make some money too. I think that's the only reason they're really wanting to pass a lot of these regulations is it's a way for them to make money. Just submitting, just paying the fee for an application process, just to ask permission to start an exchange is probably going to be a pretty large fee, and then there's a lot of personal information they want from that. So it does allow opportunity for political activism, if that's something that you're interested in doing, and I would encourage you to look into that. I think that what we're seeing now is they probably will pass, but over time you will see people kind of going in an opposite direction from that. It depends on the states, so sometimes New York is kind of like a template for laws, and they just kind of say, oh, we're just going to use New York's laws. I'm from Florida, and Florida is not the best at, there's failure at every level of government in Florida. But they kind of take templates, and this is how it's going to be. This is going to be really hard to open an exchange. And there are ways around that. You can not use the exchanges. You can hold all of your Bitcoin in Bitcoin and not convert it back out to fiat. But what it comes down to is activism in general is really hard, thankless work, which is why most people aren't going to do it. You can make it fun, but sometimes you're a Salon article away from snapping and climbing a clock tower. Now, we're used to consuming all of this kind of negative media, and I think libertarians are some of the most well-informed people, but there's all this negative media that we're constantly consuming. It can be kind of doom and gloom. It can be motivating, but it can also be draining. And especially for people active in Bitcoin, we've kind of been on this wave of like good and bad news, with a lot of the bad news focused on some of these corrupt exchanges. So you can understand why some people would want regulations on these exchanges, because they've run off with a lot of people's money. Like MT Gox is one of the more recent ones, ran off with millions of dollars in Bitcoin. And it's horrifying, and this is where kind of self-regulation needs to come into place too. But Bitcoin is decentralizing activism in a kind of different way that we haven't seen before. And one of the ways to do it, again, I mentioned there's a lot of overlap with libertarian anarchists in the Bitcoin space, but there's also a lot of variety. You see a lot more political variety in the Bitcoin space. And I think that's a really good thing, because I think that there are a lot of different solutions we can have to these problems that involve talking to each other and making sure that, I think if someone's goals are 99% the same as yours, they might be good to partner with it on some level, even if they differ philosophically. So one of the ways that I first that kind of really piqued my interest in Bitcoin was when I learned about Silk Road. And this is probably where, a lot of people first learned about Bitcoin, is like, what is this thing called the Silk Road? And it started, many average people began using Bitcoin as a currency to purchase goods and services on the Silk Road. And these people were not very politically motivated, likely not at all. Most of them probably weren't. They were just buying a service and buying goods, because of their own self-interest, because of what they like to do. And the Silk Road, along with other deep sites, they offer a variety of goods and services, and not all of these fall into the category of drugs, even though that's probably the main narrative that you've heard. What the narrative failed to mention was the success the Silk Road had with supplying safe and effective products to clients with an accurate rating system. So you were able to kind of vet the person you were buying these goods from. And rating systems are, incredibly effective in a lot of ways. So you kind of saw this applied to, gray and dark market activity. And according to University of Lausanne criminologist David Dicari-Hettu and University of Manchester law professor Judith Aldridge, the sites like the Silk Road actually reduced violence in the drug trade. What the Silk Road did is they took away power from the cartels and put it back into the hands of nonviolent recreational users, if those were the people, buying drugs. And most of these people use softer drugs as opposed to hard drugs. You probably heard the very worst from the media, and like, oh, they're selling heroin and meth on the Silk Road. Well, it was actually a very tiny % of what they were selling. Most of it was, things like, strains of marijuana. And in fact, the study, by the criminologists also mentioned that, quote, drugs typically associated with drug dependence, harmful use, and chaotic lifestyles, parentheses, heroin, methamphetamine, and crack cocaine, do not appear much on the Silk Road and generate very little revenue. Again, these were, not the scary drugs that you've probably been told. And when people would use the Silk Road to buy goods, they unintentionally became activists. In the study I mentioned earlier about everyone hates activists, the term activist was referring to the obvious ones, the intentional activists of any kind who were clear about their goals. Now, with the increase in deep websites bolstering suppressed markets, people are building the counter-economy without possibly even realizing it. They're motivated simply by their self-interest to purchase these goods that the government has decided they don't need. So it's these unintentional activists, the grandmother with glaucoma buying medicinal-grade marijuana, or maybe her son or more, savvy grandson, or the man with a compromised immune system buying life-saving medication, who were helping to chip away at one of the most lethal and discriminating wars in recent history, the drug war. And the Silk Road, I mentioned earlier that they drastically reduced violence in the drug trade, and this was just by the very small percentage of users who were savvy enough to find out how to access the Silk Road. So if you can make this much of an impact with a tiny amount of people, imagine if you were to get more people using these services. And I think as the general public becomes more aware of tools like the Onion Router and they start, encryption becomes more easily used and accessible, we're going to see an increase in people using black market online sites, whether governments like it or not. You're not going to stop the drug trade. People are going to innovate. This is something people really want. So you're not going to see this kind of like pulling back all of a sudden. You're only going to see an increase of it. There's always been a demand from a large portion of people. Again, most of which are apathetic about politics. So And they're not activists. Again, these are not people who are activists. These are people who are just looking to, spend their private time in a pleasant way. Now, even with the most recent raids on some of these darknet sites, we're seeing more of them being made. The government is playing an eternal game of whack-a-mole with these sites. As soon as they take Silk Road down or some of these other, Sheep Marketplace was one, things like that, another one pops up, and multiple ones of them pop up. And I've even heard the analogy used that it's like a hydra. You cut the head off and like a million more grow. But I would use caution if you are interested in using these sites. I think there's a high possibility that a lot of them are probably run by the government. Especially with more of the more recent busts, if you've kind of looked into the details, it's a little bit concerning how either intentionally lazy or just regular lazy that some of the people operating them were. And, hiring government agents, things like that. So, be really careful, if you're going to use these sites. And, it really is a pity, though, because here's, the government starting some of these sites which radically reduce violence from the drug war, and instead of offering a useful service for once, they're busting people who are committing violent crimes instead. So, that's really unfortunate. But, what we're seeing, but again, like this all comes down to like a diversification of tactics. While these visible activists are making great strides publicly, despite a lot of animosity from the general public, these unintentional activists are working behind the scenes in these kind of self-interested acts of civil disobedience. So Bitcoin is changing the way about how we define activism and how we think about activism, and opening up this whole new world of gray and black market stimulation, and it can aid in helping sick people, reducing violence from the drug war from both government agencies and cartels, and helping fund safe and effective rating systems that reduce harm across the board. And I do want to say, it's not just about buying drugs on the Silk Road. It's a broader consumer movement too. In some ways, this emerging space is a slacktivist dream. Even just by using a currency not backed by war and oil, you're engaging in economic activism against the state. For market anarchists, this makes your activism a lot more effective. And it's a form of direct action voting, where you choose to support and use another currency and put your economic action into economies you believe in. And I would say, it's arguably more effective than voting, and it is a form of voting. Maybe not in the political sense there, but what's making this kind of easy for people who maybe aren't that motivated to do hard activism, but maybe kind of like a softer form of activism, is all of the services coming out making this a lot easier. So there's these services coming out making the ability to use Bitcoin a lot easier for social media users. One of the services is ChangeTip, which can be used on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Hashtagtivists can now make use of their typing for a change by sending Bitcoin to anyone very easily. And this is great. It's a very fun little, tipping device to use. Because what it comes down to is a part of our culture is consumerism. And whatever your thoughts on the value of consumerism, it's interesting how it's going to fuel a whittling away of the fiat-backed economy. Some of the consumers consuming boosts growth in the economy and that they're spending their wealth in, and they're going to use the easiest, coolest tech available, without possibly even realizing that their purchases are fueling this new economy. And I will say, there are very few things you can't buy with Bitcoin. Something I have to mention, because I just find it hilarious, is a service called shitexpress.com. This allows you to send poop in a tin to anywhere anonymously for cryptocurrencies. So, what we've kind of seen, right? So, there's this market for vengeance, like vengeance is like this strong market, and I think we're really going to see this possibly even get widespread adoption further, especially during the 2016 elections. I'm not saying send poop in a tin to politicians, but you can do that.
Spray the poop on the government buildings. Did you read about that?
I missed that one. So, like I said, you can buy more things with Bitcoin than you can't. But even if buying stuff isn't your focus, you can still be an unintentional activist. So guess what? Even if you're just hoarding Bitcoins and you're not into all of that charity and consumerism stuff, you're participating in activism. Cody Wilson of Defense Distributed has said holding dollars is a political decision. That is absolutely right. So is holding Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin. You're engaging in transferring capital from one economy into another, and by holding this deflationary currency, you're also participating in a form of self-empowerment. Now, for millennials, I think this is really important because it opens up different opportunities financially for a generation that is ridden with debt and doesn't have a whole lot of hope for the future. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of apprehension coming from millennials in regards to the current financial situation and the future financial situation. So if you do believe that Bitcoin will become widely used, or at least the technology it's based on, blockchain technology, then a lot of millennials expect the price, who hold Bitcoin, expect the price of Bitcoin to increase. It is a deflationary currency, so that would seem like it would be the right thing. But even if it's not Bitcoin or something, it's going to be blockchain technology. This is going to be widely used in the next few years. And empowering younger generations, I think, is a really big part of Bitcoin. A lot of the users are a lot younger. They're more tech savvy. I mean, something that was really adorable that I saw at Coins in the Kingdom was one of the speaker's sons was going around selling little Bitcoin mugs for Bitcoin. And this kid had a team of other kids working for him to sell these mugs, and they were the most insistent, cutest kids ever. I mean, I almost had to buy all of them because it was every time you turned around, he was like, here, buy a mug. And they were really cool mugs. So, even past millennials, these younger generations are getting more involved. And I think that's really empowering because it's going to be another way that they can survive more easily in this kind of uncertain but debt-ridden future. But ultimately, what destabilizes regimes is economic, and there's a good chance that as long as governments keep manipulating currency, regular people are going to be driven to other currency markets out of just survival, out of pure necessity. So as we see the value of any currency decline, people move to stronger currencies, whatever those happen to be. And I'm of the opinion that maybe a dollar collapse is a bit far off for this country, but in other places, like Cyprus, Spain, Greece, Argentina, and Venezuela, the possibility of a currency collapse is quite real. If the US wants to crack down on Bitcoin through regulations, I think they'll be making a really terrible economic mistake. And I think what you're going to see is people who are already using currencies that are struggling much more than the dollar are looking for stronger alternatives. And it's a possibility that some of them are looking to Bitcoin. In fact, in Cyprus, you can now major in, trying to think of the term, it's digital, it's a digital currency major that's focused on Bitcoin. And it'll actually be taught by Andreas Antonopoulos, if any of you are aware of him in the Bitcoin space. So, they are already embracing this, as something very serious that can help their people. And, I think we'll really see this kind of taking off in other countries. And even people migrating to start Bitcoin companies outside of the US if this kind of regulatory intimidation continues. Now, another way that we're kind of seeing things, so when there's currency problems, there's a lot of economic stability in these countries, and people, or maybe there are, other problems, instability, so people are going to move to more prosperous places to just survive and support their families. So another field that we're kind of seeing the creation of unintentional activists in is the field of remittances. So if any of you are familiar with Western Union, they charge up to 12% to send money to the poorest parts of the world. And this is really, it's not only is it unnecessary to do on some level, but it's completely scalping. You're demoralizing these people who have to send money back. They don't have any other choice but to use these services. So Bitcoin as an affordable way to transfer value is highly useful to people moving here from other countries who just want to support their families. They can save more of their money by converting dollars into Bitcoin and sending it to their families, and the fees for that are about half of 1%. And this again feeds positive economic growth, and it starves exploitative corporations, again, which I think are just as serious of a problem as government agencies. And as people move to these prosperous areas to build better lives for themselves, the work that they have to take is low pay. A lot of people are undocumented. This is a serious problem. And what they're doing is they're not activists. They're not trying to draw attention to themselves. They're trying to fly under the radar and just be left alone and just work and provide for their families. So they're way, way, way less likely to be activists. And simply sending money home for them is this necessary task. And any way that these people can keep more of their capital should really be embraced, and I view Bitcoin as a way to do that. I will say I want to temper my enthusiasm about remittances a bit by saying that the infrastructure in some of the developing countries still needs to really be developed and worked on. I don't think it's too far off, but we do need to see a little more infrastructure being built up and things like that. It may be a little ways off, but I think it's still a strong possibility that we'll be seeing in the future. But what it comes down to, though, is because of this variety offered in the variety of opportunity offered in the Bitcoin community, you can be a political activist, counter-economic activist, or even non-activist, and still have a meaningful impact with something that's going to be used very widely in the future, which is just blockchain technology. What we're seeing is effective, decentralized, spontaneous diversity of tactics among the people using blockchain technology, participating in activism and not participating in activism. So even unintentionally, the people are participating in counter-economics, and it only takes a small critical mass of people before significant disruption can occur. If this can happen, maybe we can see Bitcoin being the grenade in the machine instead of sacrificing our body on the gears of it. So I'm about to finish up. I want to give you some resources to get involved if you're new to Bitcoin and you haven't heard much about it. I'm sure you've probably heard a little bit about it from your libertarian friends. In fact, the ones who seem to know about it are kind of can't stop talking about it. And I'm one of them. Like, once you get a Bitcoiners talking about Bitcoin, it's hard to get them to shut up about it because we're just really excited. Almost. It is almost like a drug. So talk to some of those crazy Bitcoiners. They're going to totally be down with helping you and giving you even more resources that you need. I have a weekly show called Crypto Combos, and that's where I interview a lot of people active in the Bitcoin community and larger kind of crypto space. And I encourage audience participation during this, so you can ask questions, and I highly encourage people to kind of get involved because it's something that I'm learning more about too, and I learn more with each interview that I do. And also, we have quick start guides at the Bitcoin Not Bombs table. Those, show reputable companies that you can buy Bitcoin from, spend Bitcoin, all these things. So those are a great way to get your family involved or your friends involved, is just handing out, these pamphlets. Maybe it's hard for you to explain to them because you don't quite grasp it yet. So these are a good outreach tool. You can just kind of hand them out to people, and it's very non-intimidating. And I do want to mention a few other talks if you're looking to learn more. At this festival. So Devin Reed's on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Angela Keaton will be speaking on Bitcoin and war. Bit by Bit, the trajectory of peer-to-peer, it will be by Jeffrey Tucker. Travel the World with Bitcoin by Catherine Bleich. Bitcoin Wallets, Balancing Security, Privacy, and Ease of Use by Paul Puey. And I strongly suggest going to that one if you're interested in the kind of security facets of the wallets, because, again, it's something that really needs to be researched, and it's something you want a very good understanding of, because we're seeing a lot of hacks. There are problems with people losing coins, and there's some simple security steps that you can take to prevent that. And then on Sunday, Davi Barker, Angela Keaton, and myself will be doing a panel on Bitcoin and charities titled Bitcoin is a Force for Good. So Bitcoin isn't just a currency. It's a protocol, it's a network, there's so many other facets to it. There's social and cultural facets to it, there's political facets to it, there's philosophical implications. So find out what you're interested in and look into that side of Bitcoin, if you already have a base understanding of those topics. I think you'll be able to learn a lot more, and Bitcoin encompasses a lot of different things, intentional activism and unintentional activism. So, and with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
One of the things that came to me while you were talking about how the government goes after these websites that promote nonviolent communication between people reminded me of how when they had this big stockpile of all this ivory, and they just decided to burn it all or destroy it all, so then that way, I don't know, but then that would drive the price up some more.
Mm-hmm. Right. You see a lot of destruction, from governments, just in the things that they create, and that they're not that they create, but they get other people to manufacture. You see this with weapons too. Them destroying, massive amounts of military weapons, after a certain point because they're either, no longer useful or they have new toys, things like that. So, yep. Yes.
I just want to say, for all the bad they do, it's kind of nice that they keep making all these drug marketplaces for us.
Right. Well, yeah, this is kind of like it's kind of mixed feelings. It's like, I know I'm not pro-government, but it's like, man, they're providing these services still. I mean, right before they bust you, but it's totally like duplicitous, but yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
You were saying how businesses have been moving to other countries because of the regulatory policies here in the U.S. Do you know of any more Bitcoin-friendly countries for businesses?
I know. I believe it's Coinapult has relocated outside of the country. I know some people are saying that places in South America or Singapore is another name that's often mentioned. Panama. Yeah, Panama is another one.
New Hampshire, of course.
New Hampshire is, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So so those would be the kind of countries for now. So.
I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
I guess just to give a little background about what things you think what parts of third world countries you think need to be improved for Bitcoin to be better used there. You touched on it a little, but I don't know if you have any examples of what needs to change.
Well, making internet access more accessible in general, I think would be a good step. It's an infrastructure problem, I think, and it's also maybe, a focus on different necessities too. I think maybe more importantly than getting them to use Bitcoin as a currency would be making sure that they're able to get food and just kind of basic necessities. Because even if you support, helping people in other countries, foreign aid is taking money from rich people or poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries a lot of times. So we need to find ways to circumvent that system and make it more peer-to-peer and directly connected to each other. So it's mostly an infrastructure thing. There needs to be more accessibility to just the internet in general. And I think the internet as a tool of communication is just it's rapidly improved, a lot of things for a lot of people. And I think, everyone should have access to that. Yes.
So one interesting thing, just keying in off of one of the things you just said about the technology infrastructure getting built up, right? There are companies that are using other ways to use existing infrastructure technology. Like, for example, Local Bitcoins has a way that you can transmit your Bitcoins through a Local Bitcoins deal using a text message. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to have access to technically the internet, because there's a company or somebody who wants to sit in the middle and be the gateway between two different types of network technology. So
yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I meant to add that in my speech. I believe BitPesa is working on that, and there are other groups who are you can send Bitcoin through text message. So yeah, you don't have to necessarily have a smartphone to use Bitcoin.
And there are countries that have taken the complete step, like in countries like the United States, we had, at the time when the telephone was invented, we ran all this cable, right? And that's what we did. Well, now, the United States is going through their cellular phone technology so quickly, within 10 years, that the technology becomes obsolete. Well, that gets to be resold on the secondary market and build up the infrastructure in those other countries where, instead of throwing it into a landfill, we're just selling it off to the next developing market.
Right, that's true. And you're also seeing, and this is something that people kind of have mixed feelings about, but I think it's a good thing. When I was speaking about homelessness activism earlier, there are a lot of homeless people who have access to cheap smartphones that allow them to convert their Bitcoins, into food. Places like Papa John's, like Gift is an application they can use for that. And that's actually been widely used in Pensacola. And, I think that's a great thing. I'm not one of those people who looks at a homeless person with a smartphone and is like, oh, it is welfare, people are. I think it's a great thing that, homeless people are using smartphones, and maybe not smartphones too. Like, again, this applies to people who are unbanked and people who have less opportunities in this country, so. Anyone else? Yes.
I guess one thought comes to mind when you're using Bitcoin to help people in countries where, like Afghanistan or something like that, and you're saying that a part of it is teaching them how to use this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I would think is that they depend on it so much. I mean, if it is going to be helpful for them, they're going to depend on it so much, and I'd be concerned that they might lose their private keys or something like that. Like, they really have to know what they're doing, and it's kind of worries me,
Yeah, I've thought about that too. That's a concern I have, as we bring people more into this, digitally connected space, just in regards to the kind of broader, internet too. So education is a key thing, and I think if people aren't, properly educated, then it's not going to be super useful to give them currency that they don't quite understand. So I think there just needs to be more of an effort on a larger scale with education. So, good point. All right. All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for watching this presentation. Visit Roberts & Roberts online at rrbi.co for all your precious metals needs. Roberts & Roberts not only accepts Bitcoin, they prefer it. If you enjoyed this video, also consider donating to Red Pill Productions.